Hey guys, you're listening to episode 277 of The Modern Acre. This week, we're talking to Paul Pittman, who is the founder and executive chairman of Farmland Partners. Farmland Partners is America's biggest farmland REIT by acreage. They're a publicly traded real estate investment trust that purchases, leases, and manages high-quality farmland throughout North America.
You're listening to the Modern Acre Podcast. Every week, you'll hear from the entrepreneurs, innovators, and leaders that are changing the food and agricultural industry on and off the farm. Your hosts are Tim and Tyler Nuss. They are brothers, fifth-generation farmers, and entrepreneurs who have scaled tech startups, developed international supply chains, and built brands. The Modern Acre is ag built different.
So Ty, it's been a while. I think we should give a little health and wellness update on what we're up to personally. I know that you've been training for a big event the past couple months. Give everyone an update on what you've been up to.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of comes down to like the whole question of when a tree falls in the woods, if no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? I can make a parallel to running a half marathon. Right? If I were to run a half marathon in the woods and no one saw it and I didn't post about it on social media and I didn't talk about it on my podcast, did it actually happen?
That is the big question.
So I ran a half marathon with my wife this weekend. I made it. I text the family group text him that we didn't die. And that was basically the goal. It's my first half marathon. The most I've done before was a 5K, which I gloat about, religiously because of my really fast time when I was in college. But I'm not a runner, not a particularly good runner. But my wife really wanted to do a half marathon together. And the saying, Tim, bringing up a few sayings here, happy wife, happy life.
So true.
So we've been training over the past few months for the half marathon, and it has been a journey. What I learned, it's a big time commitment. I did not anticipate it taking so much time, but you're going on these long training runs. So that was a big unforeseen thing, was just my limited amount of time. And then we also both struggled with little minor injuries late in the training process that kind of derailed all of this great foundation we had built up to. So it was kind of a scramble the last month to most importantly get healthy so I could actually run it. So, it was a little turbulent there. My mother-in-law absolutely did not think I was going to be able to run it because I was dealing with some plantar fasciitis. And I just, in my head, I was like, there's no chance I have to make this happen. And fortunately, timing worked out, recovery Ty was in full swing, and we made it happen. We only fought once during the half marathon. Ruth's pace was kind of breaking down a little bit. I was wanting to go faster. We got in a little argument. Then we had to stop for a restroom break, and I basically lost all momentum and motivation, and we kind of limped along to the finish line. So started really strong. Then it was kind of a struggle bus to the finish line the last few miles, but we made it.
Sounds like quite the experience, Ty. But the big question is, are you going to get a little sticker that says 13.1 and put it on the back of your truck? Are you going to be one of those guys?
I wouldn't desecrate the Rivian with any stickers, Tim. Stupid question.
Oh, man. I think the only race I've ever done was when you and I did Tough Mudder. Yeah,
Tim, you got to step up the cardiovascular endurance piece of your exercise regimen, Tim.
I know. I've been getting on the Peloton a few times a week, Ty. Don't worry.
All right. I don't think I'm going to be doing another half anytime soon, but I think Ruth and I are interested in maybe doing another one in maybe a year and a half or 2 years or something, because it is fun to train for something, have that, but I think we need to do it when both girls are in school full time.
Yeah, I think so. Ty, if you want to do a 5K turkey trot, you can count me out.
Okay, great. I'll just do it with Dad. Thank you for tuning in, putting up with our health and wellness fitness talk. We're super excited for this conversation. This was really great to hear from Farmland Partners. Tim, we've known about these guys for a long time because they are the biggest real estate investment trust out there, managing the most acreage. It's publicly traded, and it was super awesome to be able to get their founder, executive chairman, and former CEO, Paul Pittman, on the podcast to just hear his story about how he started this company, started this business, why he ended up going to the REIT model, how they think about farmland in general, the industry, where it's going. We're going to start the conversation with Paul sharing what's top of mind.
Well, I think one of the big things affecting agriculture is this whole idea of carbon cycle and carbon sequestration. And there's a bunch of things going on that make it really difficult for farmers to manage in this process. The first thing is think about agriculture from the standpoint of what that industry is compared to other industries. And I'll pick on something I love to do, which is skiing, for example. And, when you look at agriculture, it's an absolute necessity. I mean, the society has to eat. And the truth is humans aren't net zero. I mean, we have consumptive needs of all sorts of resources. And that's going to cause certain, creation of a certain amount of carbon. But then you look at a different industry like downhill skiing. Well, you can buy offsets for that, so to speak. But the truth is you could just not have it. Now, I don't advocate that because it's something I enjoy doing, but it's not actually fair to compare motorboating or downhill skiing to food production. The other thing on the carbon cycle that's I think a lot of people don't think about correctly, and it's a very big driver for ag. So ag, production of any crop, and I'm going to stay to row crops for a second because in the permanent crops, it's a slightly different thing. But in row crops, there is a time of the year that it's a carbon sink. And there's a time of the year that it's not. But the point is that that's carbon that's already kind of floating around in the atmosphere. And it's just getting cycled through. And it's, plant material is absorbing carbon and releasing carbon, absorbing carbon, releasing carbon. It's not really a whole bunch of new carbon. The hydrocarbons industry, and I'm a supporter. I'm happy I have a car and I'm happy I have electricity in my house. But the science behind the carbon released from hydrocarbons is very different, right? That is some, carbon molecule that was trapped thousands of feet underground for eons. And then you bring it up and you burn it and you release it. That's a new net addition. And so, different than the first example. But again, farmland carbon in the farm cycle shouldn't be compared to carbon in the hydrocarbon cycle because it's just a circular thing versus in this is a brand new source. And I think this whole discussion is going to have some impacts that make food more expensive and growing certain crops harder. And it's not really for a huge gain, and it has huge negatives.
No, I think a lot of really interesting points there. I mean, I think a big issue with the conversation around carbon right now is that exact point of permanence. It is a carbon sink certain times of the year, and then certain operations or, having it bare in the off season, like it releases that carbon, right? So I think it's a really interesting conversation that some people are not addressing, but I appreciate that perspective. Paul, want to take a step back, learn a little bit more about you. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what ultimately led you to agriculture.
Well, I grew up in a farm family in central Illinois, very small farm. And my dad was actually a school teacher, and part owner of the farm. But, when I came out of college, I was going to go back to the family farm and join my grandfather and one of my uncles on that farm. But I graduated in 1985. That's ancient history to you guys, I'm sure. But in 1985, that is when the first Willie Nelson and John Mellencamp concert at the University of Illinois, the first Farm Aid ever, is the summer of my college graduation. Not a great time to go back to the family farm. Luckily, I had good grades and I'd been student body president. And so I went on to graduate school, eventually to Wall Street, and I was pretty successful. But I really wanted to, a little bit like you guys, I wanted to get back closer to home where I was really from. And so I had started buying farmland as an investment, and I just kept taking the capital that I was making doing this finance career and putting it into farmland. And so I gradually built up a pretty big pool of farmland that I owned, my wife and I owned. And in 2014, we took a significant amount of that land, about $70 million of farmland. It's hard to believe, but we put that into the public company and took back shares. And then from then, the public company that I run, called Farmland Partners, we grew from about 70 million in assets to about $1.4 billion in assets in, the last 9 years or so.
Wow, very impressive background and story. I think there's a lot to dig into here, but maybe let's focus on kind of that early step of you've acquired a lot of farmland and your desire to kind of turn this into a publicly traded REIT. Talk to us about that process and the decision to kind of go full-time with farmland investing.
I'd been an investment banker both in New York and London for a long time, advising companies on mergers and acquisitions, and then I left that and took that skill set and did a series of buyouts and startups. Most significant of which was a turnaround of a semiconductor company. I actually was the finance guy behind Steve Wozniak in that transaction. And he is, of course, famous and successful. And I was the number cruncher, but I was the number 2 or 3 person in the organization. So, we built a decent company and sold it. And so I was fortunate to have capital to pour into farmland. And what I learned, I bought my first farm because I'm a farm kid. I wanted to go fishing and hunt a deer and say I owned a farm. But once you put down some money, you start to really focus on the asset. And that's what I did. And I became enamored by a couple of big concepts that are universally true. First is global food demand always constantly rises. To stop that, you'd have to stop 2 things. You'd have to have population growth start to go down and wealth, average wealth across the planet go down. Because population growth is obvious, more people eat more food. But the big driver of food demand is as people move from a subsistence level of earnings to something that looks more like a middle-class American style of earnings, you want a much more interesting and frankly healthier diet, or at least most cases healthier. But you want more protein. You want more fruits and vegetables. If you just worried about getting the calories to avoid starvation, you're eating a pile of rice or a pile of corn or a pile of some other starchy product that's really relatively easy to produce in high quantities. But all of us don't. That's a boring diet. It's also not a super healthy diet. And so this wealth effect drives. And then the third concept is that the available pool of high quality farmland is always shrinking. And that's because of the other needs that we as a human population have for land, housing, for example. So you've got this setup that has created a literally decades-long, century-long history of about 11% compounded total return to farmland. And that's not the farming itself, that's the asset, okay? That's better than the S&P 500, right? And it's incredibly stable. And it's not 11% every year. It goes up to 15 and it goes down to 4 or 5, but it's got this long-term average. And there's frankly only 3 or 4 negative years in the last 100 or so. And that was in the mid-1980s, right when I graduated from college. So that's how I built it, and that's why I built it. And I thought it was a great opportunity for public market companies. So investors who don't know anything about buying their own farm could have access to the idea.
Totally. Thanks for that background. I think it's super helpful and totally agree. One thing I want to dig in on, Paul, is management, right? It's a topic that comes up a ton when we talk about farmland investing. Maybe talk about, in those early years when you were just acquiring farmland yourselves, how did you handle management? Was it leasing to local farmers? What did that look like? And then how has that evolved over the years?
So I have an agriculture degree from the core of the Midwest, hardcore corn belt, soybean belt kind of farming. I know an immense amount about crop science and all of that. But the key thing you just asked, and I ran a farm. I ran a 13,000 acre corn and soybean farm for about 5 years because I tried that before I decided to just focus on land. The thing I think most people don't understand is that the management of the land is all about the farmer himself, not the farmland owner, but the farmer. And so you need to use sensible business principles that put in place the right incentives for long-term stewardship of the land. And frankly, with rare exceptions, that's the way it's worked. That's the way it's worked forever. This concept that the American farmer is trashing the environment is bullshit. It just is. It's not true. There are bad farmers and bad practices, but largely speaking, if you analyze the negative environmental footprint from modern agriculture on a per calorie produced basis, what you see is that we are feeding more and more people as an industry with less and less negative environmental impact. And every farmer would tell you, job one, produce the food for the people. Job two, do it in the least negative environmental impact you can. And this is, I mean, you guys are from family farms. This is that's how you live. This is what you think. This is the way you are. And this sort of narrative that people in Lodi, California, or people in Champaign, Illinois need an investor from New York City to tell them how to manage the land is crazy. I mean, I'll give you a little story on sustainability. So I brought an investor from New York with me out to a farm, and we're sitting talking in the shop, in the little office area of the shop with this farmer. And this New York investor starts pestering this like 50-year-old guy about sustainability. And I was like, oh no, where's this going to go? So the farmer looks at this guy and goes, so what did your dad do? He goes, well, my dad was like a dentist or something. And what did your grandfather do? Oh, my grandfather was a professor. And what about your great-grandfather? I don't really know. He kind of came from the old country or whatever. And I said, yeah, that's kind of interesting. So let me tell you about me. And this is the farmer talking. And he goes, well, this is me, and I'm 50. And here's my son, who's 30. And sitting next to him is my grandson, who's 10. And over there in the house watching TV is my dad, who's like 72. And buried down the road in the graveyard is his dad and his grandfather. We've all been farming this land now on generation 8. Sounds pretty sustainable to me. And, he said it with a couple of expletives mixed in, of course. But it was true, right? I mean, the farmers care deeply about their land, and they're generally following land grant university recommended practices. And those land grant universities like UC Davis or University of Illinois or Iowa or Texas A&M, they largely have it right. Not perfect. It's a science that keeps moving forward. And so I think that the management of land is something that we need to not think about wholesale change. We need to think about incremental improvement all the time. And that's been going on for forever. And hopefully will keep going on.
Totally agree with you. Paul, I want to dig into the portfolio a little bit and talk about kind of crops of emphasis that you're looking at, geographies that you're focused on. When you're looking at new pieces of farmland, what really sticks out to you as a key driver that's a good asset?
Yeah, so we start with sort of the philosophy that we're not trying to kind of create a sort of portfolio that says, corn's better than rice, and rice is better than cotton, and cotton's better than almonds, and almonds are better than avocados or whatever. We look at this at very high level and say, on a U.S. output basis, round numbers that were 70% primary grains, corn, soybeans, wheat, rice, cotton. And on the other 30% is specialty crops. And that's fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, those sorts of things, what they're growing in California. And we say we want a portfolio that looks something like that. So that's the portfolio we've built. We stay around 70-30, 75-25, specialty crops, Central Valley, California type crops, and then the core of the Midwest type crops. So that's number one, and we try to keep that balance, and every farm shifts the balance just a little bit, but we try to stay in line with that. We think that's really important, and it goes back to what I said in one of the questions earlier. This is about global food demand, right? I don't want to try to guess consumer preferences. I want to just stay in the market in a broad way, and as global food demand increases, we'll be successful. So that's the first thing. The second thing, though, is we are always focused on water. And the water situation in the last decade since we founded the public company has gotten worse in many places, actually. And it makes us more scared of making further investments there and more scared of the investments we may already have. And so we are probably in a phase where we'll lighten up on regions where we think long-term water exposure is a risk. Because if you lost your water, even if everything else about that farm was great, you're done. You're destroyed as an investor if that happens. So that, frankly, means, unfortunately, probably a little less exposure in California because there's a lot of water challenges there, partly climate related, but many of them, frankly, politically related in terms of the fact that we can't get any new reservoirs built. And then, it's also, though, but it's not, California is not the only place having that problem. You've got it in essentially the entire country west of Omaha, Nebraska, right? I mean, there is a not quite enough water to go around, and it gets different. It gets worse and worse as you go farther west until you get clear almost to the coast, and then California is obviously a little different. So those are the big things we watch and focus on. And it's not as if we're going to just go and dump an entire state because we're scared of the water. But a little less weight here, no new acquisitions, and sell a few assets and gradually move your balance to places where you feel safer about the water.
Makes a ton of sense. Paul, talk to us about, as you've had a chance to reflect post-CEO, what were some of the biggest challenges or maybe changes you had to make along the way with the business?
Yeah, so, I was the founder, chairman, and CEO. I've had a fellow that's worked with me, in many different businesses I've been a part of. He's been kind of my second in command for 25 years, Luca Fabbri, and he is now the CEO. I had gotten to the point, I'm still full-time, and I'll be full-time for the foreseeable future, but I frankly gotten to the point where I was exhausted, right? I wanted a little more time on the ski hill, a little more time in the gym. I wanted a little travel with my wife. I wanted to, my kids are now in college. One's in college and one's about to go to college. I want to be able to go out and annoy them by looking over their shoulder at the local bar at the college and, just kind of be a nuisance of a dad. Because I've worked, very hard. And so that was what really drove that shift. And it's not that I work a lot less, but if you have the title CEO, you're setting the culture of the company. You got to be in the office every day. I mean, you got to be there. Can't do it remotely, so to speak. And I just wanted the freedom, to still give my knowledge and advice and input, and in some cases work, but just not feel like, I got to be there when the door opens until the door closes every single day. So that's really what's driving it. The other thing I think I learned from this experience is founders and CEOs of companies like mine, which are, successful and modest in size, frankly, from a public company perspective, I think they often hang on too long, right? It's important to begin a transition process in a way that allows you to still be engaged during a multi-year kind of transition process. If that transition process for some reason doesn't work, still actually be young enough and have the energy to step back in if you had to. But also just it's time for people with new ideas and new concepts to sort of take the reins and get things done. The other thing is that if you want to move, if the younger people in your organization want a career path, the older guy, he's got to get out of that chair, right? Or you just get everybody jammed up going, how do I get to the next step? And so it's just time to move on. It's really no more complicated than that.
That's awesome. I think a lot of self-awareness to be looking ahead the next couple of years to make sure the company's in a good position as you continue on your path. Paul, we're going to jump over to a section and zoom out a little bit and chat about the industry as a whole. I'd like to start with a spicy one. What's your ag hot take?
Well, so we kind of talked about one of the hot takes. It's the whole narrative that says farmers are trashing the planet, and I don't take a political point of view on organic or grow natural or commercial or anything else. Our perspective is if you are producing food in a legal way using best practices as defined by the laws of your state plus the kind of the land grant university recommendations, we support you. But there are realities that people have to recognize that you're not going to feed the world population we have today, either in terms of quantity or in terms of price, in a fully organic model. You guys probably read Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma. Let's use that as an example. The book, the whole concept of his book falls apart because they're starting with commercial manure, right? I mean, you go organic, but the manure is created by a big feedlot where they eat regular corn. Well, wipe out the regular corn in the feedlot, then where's the fertilizer coming from, right? So there's just a misunderstanding of the science. Now, I open my refrigerator. I'm somebody with a comfortable income. I got a lot of organic food in there. I mean, I think it's a premium product in many cases. I really do. I don't think the other stuff's necessarily unsafe. I don't think that's fair. But I drink more expensive wine than I did when I was 20, right? I drink more expensive beer than I did when I was 20, right? It's a premium product. It's okay. Don't feel bad about it. But you don't have to put down everybody else who's just trying to feed their family within their budget. And so we just have to cool off on all that, right? I mean, back to my wine example, right? The best wines in Napa County are amazing. At the $12, this stuff is okay too, right? They're both good. They both get the job done.
I love it, and I think it's about balance, right? Like I think when there's views of it's this way or nothing, that's a problem within agriculture because of a lot of points you mentioned. Paul, what emerging companies or categories are you following closely in the ag sector?
My perspective is that the thing that's most interesting that's going on in the ag sector today is the opportunity to automate. Labor is an incredibly challenging issue to every industry, construction, agriculture, so on and so forth. But it's, I think, especially challenging in ag today. The population of rural America, in many cases, California is a little different. But the population of most of rural America is actually gradually shrinking. Not only getting smaller as a percentage of the population, but truly shrinking. People go off to college and don't come back. And so what I think that automation effort will create more efficiencies, more opportunities, solve some real problems, as well as make low cost food. When you start thinking about, it scares me to death when you think about an autonomous car on the streets of suburban San Francisco or Sacramento, right? That sounds to me like an immensely complicated geospatial and programming problem to solve with relatively high risk. But if you start thinking about that very same technology in a tractor, that's very different, right? Because you can create sort of a ring fence shutdown system. If the tractor comes out of the fenced in area, and I don't mean a physical fence, a virtual fence, it just turns the darn thing off, right? There's ways that you could make that. And I think they're going to solve the problem in terms of driverless vehicles as well, but it seems a lot easier to solve in an ag context. And so I think there's going to be a lot of advancement in that. And by the way, having been a farmer myself, the first hour of driving the big tractor back and forth in the field, it's actually kind of cool. I'm a little bit of a redneck. It's kind of fun. I'll tell you what, it's not very fun in the 11th hour of the same day or the 100th hour of the same 2-week period, or whatever. And so I think it's going to be a huge thing. There'll be a lot of money made on that issue.
Paul, what's something you've changed your mind about recently?
The thing that I probably changed my mind about more than anything else is I had been thinking that U.S. agriculture, particularly the core of the Midwest, corn, soybean, row crop world, but this would also apply, frankly, to many of the key crops grown in California, that we would eventually be outcompeted by non-U.S. producers. In the case of California, it's Chile or Mexico. In the case of the row crops, it's Russia, Ukraine, Argentina, Brazil. I've come to the conclusion that that's not going to happen, at least very fast, if at all. And there's a couple reasons. One is the desire to have our food in a traceable, trackable way is so much higher if you're not shipping it internationally, right? And yeah, you can barcode it and everything else, but your confidence level in a blueberry grown somewhere in California can be much higher than a blueberry that's come all the way, all the way from Chile, for example. And the second thing so that the direct consumption crops, that's a more important issue. But then you go to the kind of big commodity crops like corn and soybeans. What Ukraine, for example, has shown us is if you do not want to find yourself dependent on some producer thousands and thousands of miles away for the primary calorie sources underpinning your food system in your country. And the United States is blessed from the fact that we have a big export business, but we also have a huge domestic consumption and production business. And we're one of the unique producers in the world where that's true. Most of the big producers are big exporters. We're a big exporter and a big consumer. And, a lot of the big importers aren't really very big producers. And so we're just in a better place. I think it's going to lead to high profitability over the long term. If you can keep the politics under control, particularly in California, for farmers and for farmland owners.
Paul, what's the most valuable lesson you've learned in your career?
Working incredibly hard is very important, but it's important to work hard at the right times, not just sort of nose to the grindstone all the time, right? If I looked back through my life and my career, there are, 20 days where the overwhelming amount of success that I created occurred. And it was all about being there on those days, and in those days, seizing that opportunity and not letting it pass you by. So that meant you kind of had to be in attendance all the time. But I think if you just can't work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I think a lot of farmers in particular can be guilty of this and abandon your family, your wife, your kids, your spouse, whatever. You got to have some level of balance in your life. But then when that key when it's your version of the big game, you got to come to play that day, and you got to just stay at it and work really hard. And I think that's something that takes a long time to, I think to be fair, if you're 20 years old or 22 years old and you just came out of college, or you're a little younger, just out of high school, that's not one of the choices. You just got to work hard all the time. But as you get a little more mature, you'll have some opportunity. You'll have some people below you that'll help you, do what has to get done. You really need to be sensitive to that. Get some balance in your life. Be available, but you don't have to always be right there chopping wood, so to speak.
That's great advice. Well, Paul, fun one as we wrap up here. What's saving your life right now?
For me, it's always the same. It's physical exercise. Got to get out and get the exercise. Besides, I'm in the food production industry, and the more I exercise, the more I get to eat. It's good for everybody.
Love it. Well, Paul, this has been a ton of fun. We really appreciate your insight and background during this conversation. As we finish up, how can listeners get in touch and connect with Farmland Partners?
Yeah, if you want easiest way to get in touch with me in particular is email. So it's just paul@farmlandpartners.com. Spelled exactly the way it sounds, paul@farmlandpartners.com.
So Tim, what'd you think?
Super fun conversation with Paul. Loved hearing his backstory and really what got him into ag real estate and starting the publicly traded REIT back in 2014. But I thought it was really interesting when he talked about management and we got into kind of, are you looking at conventional, organic, or regenerative? And his approach of being kind of agnostic on the management side, where each one serves a different purpose. And not every consumer can afford a very high-end, like luxury, regenerative, or organic product. And there's a case for consumers to be buying kind of more of a mid-range product. And so I think having that viewpoint, not being kind of like maxi about one management style versus another, I thought is a unique approach and makes a lot of sense for the context of a REIT.
Totally. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it. If you get a chance, leave us a rating and review. We'd really appreciate it. You know, Tim and I, we've been doing this podcast for 5 years, building the relationship with you guys, sharing content, sharing stories. If there's something you could do in return, a little tiny thing would be to just hit that review button, give us 5 stars or whatever you think is appropriate. We'd really appreciate it. It helps the podcast grow and it helps it get to more listeners. We'd really appreciate that, guys.